Hi, welcome to week 7 in our course, The Theology and Ethics of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. During this week, we're going to deal with justification, Christology, and the task of ethics. By the way, I've noticed that my other videos, every time that I tape them, I have the sun coming in and it's playing with my head. So, okay, you have in the background there the chief master theologian, Martin Luther. So you can look at him, right? If the sun starts to shine again through the window at this hour. Anyhow, so we are in week 7, and though the title for this week has to do with ethics, many of you will find that Bonhoeffer speaks little about ethics in most of the pages that we're going through. In a way, this is typical of, I would say, a Lutheran approach. Which can also be seen in Karl Barth's work during this era, for example, in his church dogmatics. And why I say it is a very Protestant Lutheran approach, because rather than developing, let's say, a set of abstract rules, virtues, and principles, Bonhoeffer delves first with the reality of faith, particularly with what God has done and does for humanity in Jesus Christ. It is this, we can say, religious dimension, which gives traction to a Christian ethos and therefore orients the life of the believer, gives guidance in relation to the world and the neighbor. So we must remember that in our tradition, ethics is never really for us. That is, to make us good, to make us better, more attractive, successful, more pious, or more religious, or more Lutheran, or whatever. No, ethics is always for the neighbor and the well-being of the world. So in our first essay for this week, Ethics as Formation, Bonhoeffer deals with a concern that has also become central in our curricula here at Luther Seminary. And this has to do with the spiritual and religious formation. What matters for him is to understand God's living love for the world, which leads to the question that we must pose ourselves. What does it mean that God loves real human beings? That he embraces reality as it is by experiencing and suffering the world at its worst, at its darkest places. So, central for Bonhoeffer is the event of the incarnation, something that we keep revisiting in our readings, as it was the case during last week. By the fact that God's become human, Christian ethics can never despise what God loves, Bonhoeffer argues. That is, despise the very form of God who become human. You will see in Bonhoeffer an unconditional elegy on human dignity in its true, real, and messy form. That is, not in the idealized form, but in its actuality. So he will understand the reality of faith as one of formation. No? And he uses the word there, Gestaltung, which he defines in page 93 as being drawn into the form of Christ, to be conformed to the form of the one, that is God, who became human in the life of the Nazarene. So this conformation is not a repetition of Christ or an imitation of his life, but it means to let the form of Christ to take form in us. For those of you familiar, for example, with Carl Gustav Jung's theory, think here of Christ as an archetype that serves to catalyze and shape our identity in the most profound crevices and bends of our psyche. In other words, to be conformed to Christ's form, that is to bear Christ in our lives. It is to embody the form of Christ in the world again and again and again. So you can relate this notion of formation, conformation, Gestaltung, Mitgestaltung, with the very Lutheran Protestant idea of justification, no? By grace through faith. Thus, for him, the church is not just this voluntary association that worships Christ, but it is for him, the church, it is Christ who has taken form among human beings. A piece of humanity where Christ has taken form, as he writes in page 97. So the whole point of being Christian is just, well, to be really human, truly creatures, as Luther will put it. So please keep in mind this deep humanistic implication of his Christology, his understanding of the Christian faith, and therefore understand also his allergy to any form of casuistry, that is, this attempt to impose norms and virtues upon others. The Christian, for him, as Christ himself, meets the neighbor out of the freedom that God gives. So the second essay, also unfinished, was probably begun in late 1940 and completed sometime during 1941 and early 1942 when he was revising some of his work. So it's more or less contemporary to the other essay that we were reading. So for us, it is important to bear in mind as we go through, especially this second reading, that it was written at the heyday of the German conquest of Western Europe and parts of Scandinavia, and the apparently unstoppable march toward the east after the invasion of the Soviet Union with Operation Barbarossa in June of 1941. So I want you to be aware of this context because of two things. First, because he's speaking about, in this essay, about guilt and the need for the church to bear and confess this guilt at a time when everybody was excited and enthusiastic about German victories, and the Nazi war machine appears to be unstoppable. So these are the heyday, as I say, is the heyday of Nazism before the disaster of Stalingrad in early 1943. That was the beginning of the end of Hitler's Germany. But still, we have to wait like a year and a half until this started to happen. So this is at this point, everybody thought, that the Nazis and the German army was absolutely unstoppable. So Bonhoeffer is confessing the guilt of the German nation and of the church following the structure of the Decalogue. So pay attention to the creative and rather explicit way in which Bonhoeffer is spelling out the sins of Germans and the church by illustrating with contemporary scenes of commission and omission the many ways in which each commandment has been violated. So having this context in mind, and as you read, for example, the breakdown of parental authority by a so-called revolutionary youth, remember that he's not just being patriarchal here. Although, we have talked about this, there are certain obviously patriarchal elements in Bonhoeffer's thinking. But don't, stop there and try to see that he's questioning the breakdown in the bosom of families by the indoctrination of the Hitler's youth. And remember, they were indoctrinated to be the ears and eyes of the regime, of the state, in the most private of all places, which was precisely the family. So the same applies to other apparently conservative words or stances by Bonhoeffer, as for example, when he speaks about the dissolution of the relationship between the sexes. Again, the context that we have to bear in mind here is these experiments, Nazi experiments that were going on with youth, promoting the procreation of good Aryan babies, right? To perpetuate the pure Aryan race, in complete disregard of the free and nurturing and loving environment of a committed couple. So this was the state intervening and manipulating sexual relationships, right? And dislodging the proper context, the nurturing contexts, we could say, of sexuality as God's good gift to us. So finally, there is a point in this essay where one can clearly perceive the context in which Bonhoeffer was writing. As I say, his heyday of Nazism and German conquest. And there is some enigmatic words that you will see towards the end in page 143 about the slow process of healing that follows conquest and occupation. Certainly, liberation and post-colonial theologies will not be happy with these words of Bonhoeffer. Not at all. But let's try to situate these words in the context in which they are expressed and to which they belong, as an attempt by Bonhoeffer to bring some hope for those who have been or who have fallen victims abroad to the Nazi onslaught, military onslaught. Again, it leaves much to be desired, but we must remember that these pieces that we are reading are drafts, right? That Bonhoeffer never had the chance to edit or revise in any depth before publication, which happened precisely after his death. So enjoy the readings and all the best.